Hello everyone, welcome to Horror Stories. Story 1. The tips of my fingers tapped the top of my steering wheel. I reached down to the radio and clicked the seek button repeatedly, flipping through each different station. 5:35 p.m. That is the time my clock read as I sat in traffic along Highway 70. It was a hot summer day in mid-July. I had just gotten off work, and I was ready to be home. I was used to the occasional traffic jam during rush hour, but things were moving extra slow today. I had my windows rolled down listening to Take It Easy by the Eagles. One arm rested on the outside of my window, while the other held the top of my steering wheel. I sang along as the song blared through my speakers. The traffic was dragging on. I was probably only going about 5 miles an hour. The semi in front of me put his left blinker on to change lanes, and that's when I noticed the flashing blue and red lights ahead. Great. An accident. The tune of the Eagles hummed in my ears as I tried to stay entertained. I was coming up to the first patrol car. The cop was standing outside of his car, holding orange cones in each hand. He was motioning big circles with his left arm as his right arm held the orange cone straight ahead, I guess to keep the flow of traffic moving. I kept listening to the radio and rolled forward. The back left corner of the ambulance slightly protruded into the right lane of the highway. The EMT didn't seem to be in too big of a rush, considering the magnitude of the accident. I rolled past the ambulance just as they pulled the stretcher out of the back. My eyes darted back to the road. I hoped that whoever was in this accident was okay. The cars in front of me were swerving into the left lanes ahead. I blinked a couple of times as I looked at the scraps of metal left from the totaled car. The car had been swept horizontally, blocking a portion of the right lane. I tried to make sense of what type of car it was, hoping that it was nobody that I knew, but the car was too far gone to put together a make or model. My car went past the metal debris scattered across the side of the road. I saw 2 paramedics holding up a black tarp to shield the view from oncoming drivers. As I passed the black tarp, I noticed this putrid smell that was radiating from it. The smell brought me back to junior year biology class, the day that we had to dissect pigs. The smell of the formaldehyde on the dead pig made me gag, and I couldn't make it through class that day. I then began to dry heave from the stench. I pulled over to the side of the road, thinking I was ready to throw up. Oncoming cars started honking at me as I cut them off to pull onto the shoulder of the highway. I took a few deep breaths, and another steaming whiff of formaldehyde crossed paths with my nostrils. I threw up out the window on the pavement. I used the sleeve of my shirt to wipe my mouth off, and then got behind the wheel of my car to get the hell out of there. The humidity of the day wasn't helping me feel much better, and the sun was boiling down and reflecting off the metal cars around me. The exhaust from each ignition made it seem 10 times hotter than it was that day. My sweaty palms gripped the top of my steering wheel. When I looked out my left mirror, I saw an old lady waving the universal signal saying that she would let me in. I turned the knob on my radio up to distract myself. I looked up and out my rearview mirror, and that is when I saw it. A lifeless, bloody hand lay just inches out from the black tarp. The paramedic must have seen the horrified look on my face because I saw him use his shoe to kick the hand back behind the tarp. I swiveled the wheels of my car into the left lane and proceeded on my way in the slow-moving traffic. Something felt off about this whole situation. I have cruised past a car crash before, but I have never seen paramedics be so oblivious to letting a dead body show. Plus the smell seemed unnatural for someone who had just died. Feeling unsteady, I looked again in my rearview mirror. Except this time, I didn't see a bloody hand. No, I saw something way more sinister looking back at me. The dead body was sticking out from the tarp just enough for me to see the head and upper torso. My eyes darted back and forth between the paramedics, but they didn't seem to notice the change in the body's positioning. Just then, the head of the body twisted up and smiled at me from upside down. I don't drive on Highway 70 anymore. Story 2. I remember the apartment being eerily cold when we walked in. It was probably in the low 60s outside, but it somehow felt even colder in our one-bedroom domicile than it did in the draft courtyard. I mentioned it to Ben. He didn't even respond. He already had the game on and was complaining about the luck of the football team from some city across the country he would never even go to. I'm gonna warm up in the shower. I put the statement out there 60% as a notification and 40% as an offer. Ben responded with a sound that I'm not even sure qualifies as a grunt. I let the shower warm up and then slipped in. I felt the grime of the workday, the after-work drinks that we had to have with Ben's boss, and the chill of the night wash off me as soon as the stream of water hit my body. The first couple of minutes of the shower were utter bliss, one of those moments when you feel like nothing else in life could ever be better. I never wanted to get out. Then, I heard the sound of Ben peeing on the other side of the shower curtain. "Ben," I said in a thoroughly annoyed tone, "please just don't flush the toilet." I heard the urine stop. I didn't hear the toilet flush. I heard Ben walk out of the bathroom. I showered for another 10 minutes before I got out. I dried off and headed back to the bedroom. I glanced over at Ben on the couch, still glued to the game. I heard him muttering something about a fumble. "Thanks for not flushing the toilet," I said before ducking into our bedroom. "I didn't go to the bathroom," Ben said. I stopped in the doorway and then walked back into the living room. "Don't lie, I heard you peeing when I was in the shower." Ben threw his hands up, eyes still on the game. "I have not gotten up from this seat since we walked in, it's overtime." Ben insisted in his tone where I know he is telling the truth about something. The warmth of the hot shower slithered off me in a second. "Don't mess with me," I stated coldly to Ben. I swear to God I didn't go in there. The entire room started to feel dangerous. I didn't even know what to do. I stood there shivering in nothing but a towel. Ben rose to his feet and walked towards me. I watched his eyes scan the room with a fear in them I had never seen before. He stopped in the doorway and grabbed me. He covered my mouth and perked his ear. I didn't hear anything other than the distant, ominous ring of a siren. We stood silent for a few more moments. I heard nothing. The siren was gone. "We would hear something if someone was in here," Ben said. Ben reluctantly agreed to search the apartment. We searched the place up and down and found nothing. It was actually worse than finding a junkie with a bloody knife or some hideous monster. The mystery of the whole thing was worse than any nightmare I could have imagined. The next few weeks were tense. I wouldn't stay in the apartment alone. Ben told me my brain must have just played a trick on me. That was a bad idea. He said there was no other possible way it could have happened. It was not a good idea on his part to tell me that. I lost trust in him. What happened was definitely not in my head. I knew it. I got my confirmation a few weeks later when I stood in the shower getting ready for work. I was almost done with the shower when I heard a flush ring out from the other side of the shower curtain. I couldn't dodge the water in time and took a stinging hot stream to the face. I screamed out and ripped open the shower curtain. No one was there, but I heard footsteps walking away from the open bathroom door. I heard the front door unlock, open, and then close again. Then, I called out, my body cold despite the hot water pounding on my back. No answer. I shivered into a towel and walked into the bedroom. No sign of Ben. I checked out the living room. There was a handwritten note on the coffee table. I had to go to work early today. Signed, Ben. Thanks, Ben, very helpful. I called him. He was clearly annoyed. Worse yet, he confirmed that he did not flush the toilet when I was in the shower. He left before he even heard the shower come on, apparently. I listened to the space around me in the apartment. I don't even know what Ben said after that point. Everything was silent, but it felt like the entire apartment was alive at that point. I ended the call with Ben. One thing was clear. Whoever had been sneaking around the bathroom while I was showering had a way to get in and out of our apartment. Or it was Ben and he wanted to deeply disturb me for some reason. Ben continued to swear up and down that it was not him doing this. He brought up the idea of me inventing the whole thing in my head again. I offered a solution. What if we set up cameras in the apartment? I wanted to record the entire apartment. Ben didn't want to spend that much money. We settled on recording the front door and the bathroom. I reviewed the tapes each day at work. Weeks went by without so much as a hint of anyone doing anything at any moment of the day, let alone when I was in the shower. All I saw was Ben and I going about our sad daily existence of barely talking to each other and going back and forth to work. The fear that all of this was in fact in my head started to bubble. I felt a tension from Ben when he asked me about every other day if I saw anything on the camera. Our already strained relationship felt like it was hanging by a single thread. We were barely talking. Then, it came to a head when I reviewed the footage about a month after I set up the cameras. The footage from the bathroom proved fruitful while I was in the shower. I felt I could almost smell the soap and feel the moisture in the air when I stopped the bathroom footage once I saw a shadow appear in the screen of the bathroom window. I stopped breathing as I watched that shadow pull away the screen and then slither into the room. The light wasn't very good in the bathroom with me taking the shower after my nightly workout just around dusk and I hadn't turned on the bathroom light. However, I could see what looked to be a stout man in black pants, a hoodie, and wearing a pure white mask standing in my bathroom right next to me as I took a shower. I couldn't believe I still showered with the curtain closed at that point. I hated myself almost as much as I was scared as I watched the footage. Those feelings burned as I watched the man just stand there for a few seconds before heading over to the toilet. The sound of the shower stopped on the video, replaced by the pouring sound of the rest of the shower water exiting via the bathroom faucet. I would open the curtain any second. I wondered how in the hell I hadn't caught the man dressed in black the night before when I got out of the shower. What I watched next made the vomit literally bubble up in the back of my throat. I couldn't believe what I saw. In a flash, the man reached down, stuck his fingers against the floor of our bathroom and yanked on one of the tiles. I watched about half of the bathroom floor rise up and about a foot off the ground. The man slipped into the dark opening he unveiled, and then disappeared into the floor before it slowly eased back into the ground right when I opened up the shower curtain. I watched myself get out of the shower, grab a towel and head to the bedroom in real time and then fast-forwarded through the rest until the new video ran out. The guy never got out of the floor, meaning he had been in there the entire night until I left for work and could still be in the apartment. One burning thought simmered in my mind when the realization washed over me. It was the day before Veterans Day, and Ben had the day off, while I didn't. He was still at home with the man in the bathroom floor. I scrambled to call Ben as soon as I could, but there was no answer. I called again, no answer. I called the cops and drove back home without telling my boss anything. The cops were already there when I arrived. They busted down the door under my phone direction and found the apartment entirely empty. There was no one in the hollowed-out section beneath the bathroom floor, and Ben's cell phone was in the bedroom, but he was not. The police found spikes stuck in the side of the building, which led all the way up from the alley behind our building to our third-floor bathroom window. They looked to be what a mountain climber would stick in the rock of a cliff to pull their way up. They believe he must have lived in one of the other tall apartment complexes nearby and spied on me. They believe he broke in during the day sometime over and over again while the two of us were at work, and cut out our bathroom floor and then dug out the area to create a hiding space a little bigger than himself where he could hide when he needed to. They said he seemed incredibly skilled at what he did and likely had been doing it at the apartments all around our neighborhood. The story of Ben was far more disturbing. The police found his car parked on the sidewalk a few blocks away in its usual spot, and his cell phone on top of the bed, but that was it. He vanished without a trace. I have since moved out of the apartment, and Ben has yet to show up. I moved a few cities over back to my parents' home to try and throw the scent off from whoever was doing it. The limited clues and leads the police possess have been shared over the past few months, but none of them seem to lead anywhere. There is one insight the officers gave to me that has stuck with me throughout the process and my lonely days of working, watching TV on my parents' couch and struggling to sleep. One of the officers told me that they don't think that Ben had anything to do with the sneak-ins of the masked assailant or his disappearance, but they think I should be on the lookout for people in my life. I can still remember the cops' exact words. They were, "Generally, in cases like this, people think it is some random mystery man that is coming in and doing something creepy, but in reality, the perpetrator almost always has something connected to the person they are terrorizing. Most of the time, it's someone they know. Good luck ever trusting anyone again." Story 3. My cousins live in North Dakota, and I spent winter break their freshman year in college. We were at their friend's house one night, drinking in her basement with some other girls, and it was really late, like 3 a.m. I was falling asleep, so I decided to walk home. They live in a desolate area with lots of snow, and it gets really cold, especially at night. But the houses weren't too far apart, and when the moon is out, it seems light outside. The path we always take is straight behind the house through some wooded areas and then more open land, and as I was shuffling home through the snow with my head down, I look up to the left of my 10 o'clock, and probably like 75 yards away is another figure walking in the opposite direction. I saw him a split second before he saw me, and when he did, he kind of jerked his arms and his shoulders up, obviously startled from the sight of me. I laughed out loud for some reason, just from the shock or something, and gave him a little wave like, "Oh, you startled me, haha, sorry," kind of thing. He just stood there and stared at me. I thought he was going to say something for a second, and so I was stopped too, just looking at him. He had a full-face ski mask on, and I could tell that it was a man cause he was really tall, but he didn't say anything. So for what felt like forever, it's just me and some stranger in a ski mask looking at each other in the desolate woods in the middle of winter at 3 a.m. A huge chill went up my spine, and a voice said, "You need to get the hell out of here right now." I turned and started walking as fast as I could the other direction. I have never been that scared in my life. I was a little drunk and stoned and very paranoid. I imagined me walking home from the opposite perspective, and the man is running up behind me with an axe. So I started sprinting as fast as I could all the way back home, thinking that this guy could easily follow my tracks in the snow and I'm going to get murdered. Luckily I didn't, but I don't think I'll be visiting them again anytime soon. Story 4. My longtime girlfriend and I were on this off-trail hike that had an extremely long and steep cliff to reach a small rock overhang that looked over cliffs and the ocean. As it came in view, we noticed there was an old lady already sitting up there with a sketch pad. We started making jokes, saying that maybe it was not a woman and it's actually Norman Bates waiting to throw us off the cliff. So for 20 minutes we are kidding around like this, and as we finally approached, you could not see the top because it was so steep. So we finally make it onto this tiny overhang, and the old woman turns around to look at us, and it's an insane looking man wearing a dress, and his hair is in small braids with rubber bands, and to be clear, this was not a normal looking person, not a quiet person looking to be by themselves in the wilderness. This was escaped convict, hardened face looking psychopath. We said hello, and he said nothing but just stared at us. We tried to act as normal as possible and calmly turned around and headed back down. Story 5. Let me preface this by saying that I realize that camping alone in the middle of nowhere isn't the smartest activity a person can engage in. I've lost count of the times that well-meaning busybodies have lectured me about it, but frankly, I just don't care. You see, all of my life I've done things that I don't particularly want to do. I went to school, I got a job, I pay my bills. Camping, the stillness and the solitude of the forest at night gives me joy, and joy seems in short supply most days. I never felt afraid in the woods, no matter how remote. I only ever felt calm, peaceful, like I was doing what I was always meant to do. That doesn't mean that I never took precautions. There are 3 things that a solitary woman needs in the woods: a good first aid kit, a good compass, and a good dog. I always went out with all 3, and I always thought that those things could keep me from whatever might be out there in the forest. I was wrong, of course, but just because I only ever considered the living threats. The last camping trip I'll ever take started out normally. I had planned a 3-night loop through a stretch of woods I had never been to before. Due to the unfamiliar and remote terrain, and the fact that I wouldn't be following an established trail, I was only planning on hiking about 8 miles a day before setting up camp each evening. That way I wouldn't ever be too exhausted to make good decisions, and could generally enjoy my new surroundings more thoroughly. I loaded up my pack with all the supplies I'd need, told my parents where I'd be and when I'd return, and headed out to a part of the state that was completely foreign to me. I arrived at the forest early in the day and parked alongside a deserted stretch of gravel road. I could see no sign that the road had been driven down in quite some time, and the thought of having this whole section of woods to myself filled me with a moment of glee. That moment intensified when I opened the passenger side of my car to let Susie out. Susie was the kind of dog that provoked endless speculation about her genetic line, but ultimately she was several different kinds of mutt all rolled into one. Though not particularly intimidating to look at, Susie was loyal and protective. I wouldn't go on a hike without her by my side, and she was never happier than when she was walking along with me. Susie gave me confidence that I could handle whatever the wilderness threw my way. With my pack loaded high and heavy on my back, Susie and I headed out into the woods. The route I had chosen was rugged and varied, and often I had to stop to check my map and compass. I had opted to walk along the ridge line the first day, and found that the way was a gauntlet of loose rocks and fallen trees. There was no sign of humanity there, no empty bottles or trailblazers to pull me back into civilization. Despite the hard going, it was paradise. That evening, I set up camp at a clearing near one of the higher ridges. I turned in a bit earlier than I had originally wanted, driven into my tent by the bite of the early fall air. Susie snuggled in next to me as I zipped myself into my sleeping bag. Before I knew it, I had been lulled into sleep by the chorus of chirping night insects around me. I woke up in the early morning hours to silence. A glance at my watch showed that it was 1:45 am, too early to be anything other than dead asleep. The full moon above illuminated the night, and I spent several seconds watching the shadows of the tree branches dance across the top of my tent. It was downright cold by then, and I zipped my sleeping bag more tightly. I looked at Susie, still laying next to my body. Her eyes were open and focused on something beyond the tent. The wind must have woken her, too. I closed my eyes, hoping to fall quickly back to sleep. When I felt Susie growl against me, I murmured a reassurance. It's probably just a deer, pup. Something, though, didn't feel right. Susie wasn't the type of dog to growl at passing animals. In fact, she lived her life as though other creatures were curiosities at best, and distractions at worst. The only time I'd heard her growl like that was 2 years ago when a black bear came shuffling down the trail and caught us off guard. In a weird way, the thought of a bear outside the tent was a relief. My bag was hung from a tree, and bears in this part of the country weren't known to be aggressive. I stroked Susie's fur and waited for the animal to sniff around the campground, determined that we weren't that interesting, and then leave. I strained to listen, but all I could hear was the sound of Susie's growling, so low and constant that it could have been a purr. I waited for what seemed like hours, but never heard the animal outside. As the morning went on, Susie's growl was turned into soft whimpers, and I let her crawl into my sleeping bag with me. The sleep that came was fitful and interrupted by strange nightmares, but the morning sunlight eventually made its way into the tent. You may be wondering at this point why I didn't turn around and walk right back out of the woods to my car and back to civilization. Well, the simple reason is that I wasn't worried, so I thought. A bear came around the campsite. It wasn't that big of a deal, and besides, I'd be another 8 miles away by the time night came around again. I packed myself up, had a leisurely breakfast, and set out again. The morning's hike was uneventful and beautiful, though Susie stuck disconcertingly close by me, neglecting her usual explorations and mouth ajar with anxiety. Every time I tried to pet her, she stiffened, so I let her be and continued walking on. We stopped in a quiet clearing for late lunch, more than 6 miles into the day's hike. It wasn't until I was packing up to leave that I noticed it. The silence was total in this clearing. No birds, no chichatas, no rustle of leaves where squirrels leapt from tree to tree. It sent a chill down my spine, and I noticed Susie watching the woods ahead. "Let's get out of here, girl." She looked up at me and whined. When we arrived at the edge of the woods, I immediately saw why there were no bird songs. Their little feathered bodies lay on the forest floor, dotting the fallen leaves with reds, blues, whites, and yellows. I poked a bluebird with my hiking stick, turning it over, looking for signs of predation or illness. I saw nothing strange, other than the mere fact of the lifeless body itself. I expected to need to call Susie to me. Birds were a favorite snack, but she had backed up behind me, another low growl escaping her curled lips. I stepped back to her and clipped a leash to her collar, fearing that she might run, or that I might. The woods remained dead silent. My heart had frozen in my chest, clenched tightly but somehow beating forcefully at the same time. Something was very wrong, and I needed to get out of this forest. I stood where I was and tried to think. I was 14 miles from where I parked my car if I went back the way I came. Given the terrain, I knew I wouldn't make it back before nightfall. I had in my pack a compass and map. I could try to map a new route, one that might take me back faster, but there was no guarantee that I could find my way before dark either. I was at the halfway point of the route, and I had to make the decision, keep going or turn back. I thought back to the campsite the night before. Something was out there. Maybe it was just a bear, but maybe it was something else. The thought of going back to that spot to sleep made me shudder. I knew that I needed to keep going. I'd get as many miles as I could during the rest of the daylight hours, get a few hours of sleep, and then finish tomorrow ahead of schedule. I just had to make it through another night, and I'd be back at my car. I steadied myself and forged ahead, Susie tense beside me, hackles raised. The miles melted behind us. There were no stops, no breaks to look at flowers or have a snack. Just the constant sound of my boots striking the ground to break the unnatural quiet. Birds littered the ground, and when I came to the next clearing, I had to step carefully through a mass of bodies where a flock of starlings was downed. As I walked, I kept an eye on the trees around me, but saw no movement, only that awful stillness. Slowly the light began to fade. Its rays become orange and diffuse through the leaves. I knew that I had to stop, that I couldn't keep going through the night. The tent, though made of polyester and carbon fiber, would at least allow me the illusion of security. I found a clearing, mostly devoid of dead birds, and set up camp. Susie whimpered, "It's okay, girl. We'll be out of here tomorrow, I promise." I was in my tent before the sun finished its descent behind the trees, hand wrapped tightly around one of my hiking poles, and Susie next to me. Whatever was out there, I just hoped it would leave me alone. I drifted in and out of consciousness, the strain of the day overcoming me in waves before the nightmares pulled me back into the world. Susie didn't sleep at all, as far as I could tell. She just lay there stiffly, every so often emitting another low growl and licking her lips nervously. When I was awake, I listened. The wind moved the branches above me, but nothing else made a sound. I mentally clung to the creaks and groans of the trees, something familiar and reassuring in this strange place. Eventually, though, that too became twisted and bizarre. The branches began to sway above me ferociously, casting shadow fingers across the top of my tent. The wind, however, sounded as if it were dying down. It was as if the branches were moving on their own, but of course, that couldn't be. I sat up in my sleeping bag, freeing my arms and drawing Susie in closer to me. The warmth of her little body and the feel of her breathing gave me comfort in the moments before we both heard it. A crunch of footfall, right outside, made Susie lunge for the tent door. Frantically, she began clawing at the fabric, whining and snapping her teeth. I tried to hold her still, but she was fighting me at every turn. When the fabric ripped, there was nothing I could do. She bolted into the night. Before I could even process what had just happened, the tent began to shake. The tree branches, once just shadows upon the surface, now grasped and raked against my tent, tearing gashes along its seams. I fought my way out, still clutching the hiking pole, but hopelessly aware of how little good it did. I emerged into the little clearing of my campsite, my ruined tent illuminated by a full moon. The trees were motionless, just as they should be, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood to attention, though the air was still. The only thing that I could hear was my own ragged breath and the quick percussion of blood through my ears. I backed slowly into the bark of the nearest tree, feeling totally exposed in the clearing. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, but the silence continued. Around me the shadows morphed and writhed as the moon made its way across the sky. My eyes saw things that were not there, and the cold began to seep into my bones. I could think of nothing else to do standing alone and vulnerable in the night, so I started talking, at first to myself, and then to whatever was with me. "Please, I'm sorry." I choked back giant, ugly sobs. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I didn't know. I'm leaving, I swear. Just one more day and I'll be gone. Please, please, please," became a mantra, a point of focus for my ever-unraveling mind. Instead of looking for forms in the shadows, I instead centered my thoughts around the word, how it felt in my mouth, and how it sounded hoarser and hoarser as the night went on. By the time the gray morning light began to seep through the trees, I was numb. I was numb from fear, from cold, from grief. I was unsure if I could find the strength in my legs to hike out of this place, but I did. I left my tent where it lay in tatters and started into the woods alone. The rest of the day barely registered with me, if I'm being completely honest. I remember the silence, the feeling of being watched, and please, on my cracked lips. When I finally made it back to my car, I didn't even have the energy to cry. Sometime later, when I felt well enough to revisit my experience, I looked up at the forest, this corner of nowhere, online. I read stories about the isolation in the wilderness of the forest, about logging crews who had abandoned their machinery, about how the trails had become overgrown and useless. I had seen these stories before on my trip, and they excited me. The solitude of it all, the remote, rugged terrain that had driven the less adventurous away. But now I had context. I understood. The forest wasn't for me. It wasn't for any of us, and it made sure that it would always be that way. Story 6. So this happened a few months ago, and I'm still scared to this day. My entire life, I had never really walked home from school all the way. I'd always either been picked up or ridden the bus. So this year was my first year that I had lived near the school to walk. I wasn't in the nearby neighborhood, where 90% of the kids were. We were only living in our house temporarily, so I have to walk maybe half a mile to get home, across the highway. So, at the beginning of the year when I first started walking home, I didn't want to have to walk by the highway. The high school had a cut-through in the forest that led to a strange and creepy lone road. I wanted to be cool and get home fast, even though it was way faster just going the highway. I walked down across to the forest to get to the cut-through point. I see some older kids following me, but perhaps I'm just being paranoid. I ignored them, and they turned out to be unimportant. In my head, for some reason, I had the Halloween theme song stuck in my head, like when he was stalking them. Sort of eerie, right? But what was important was my gut feeling that maybe I should take the highway. I blamed all my gut feelings on those older kids and kept walking. Eventually, I cut through the forest and get to the road. The road is gravel with some dead grass in the middle of it. I see where the highway is, but the road seemingly extends deep into the brambly forest. I decide that this is a waste of time, and I take the highway. But the next day, I didn't want to give up. I wanted to conquer the road. So I foolishly went back to the road. Same sort of thing. An eerie, lone road with dead shrubs growing on it. I keep walking down the eerie road this time. I notice that there are 0 cars coming up or down this road. It's like it was abandoned. I kept walking into big spider webs in the middle of the road, which proved that there haven't been cars there often. Otherwise, there would be no webs. I continue walking down the road. It leads nowhere. It just keeps going deeper. Starting to get a bit scared at this point. Any car could drive down the road and take me. Nobody would hear me scream. I start jogging back up to the center of the road. I saw a big gap in the forest where there were power lines. Finally, I thought to myself. The ground next to the lines were still overgrown and full of ticks and tall grass. Not to mention thorns and sticks. I kept walking down the area. I was taking my sweet time. I finally made it to a small ravine in the middle of the road. I jumped over it and continued on my way. I eventually get stuck around a big bush because I didn't want to walk through the tall grass and get dirty. I must have been trying to work around the bush for 2 minutes. And then it slammed on me, stone cold. I look up and see a man standing a good distance away from me. I don't move. I don't say a word. My heart is pounding. This man has a creepy dark green rugged shirt. Shaggy brown hair and just overall creepy. He's staring at me. Then he grins. His face literally fucking grinned. He gestured for me to come over to him. Many steps to the side where I can no longer see him. I hear leaves crunching. He is coming after me. The adrenaline has been pumping for about 30 seconds now. I bolt like lightning fast up the hill. I don't care about not getting dirty anymore. I just want to get out of there. I finally make it to the road and I get to the highway. I turn back. No sign of the creepy man. I make it home and promise myself that I'm never, ever trying to cut through there again. The scary thing is, though, that had he just stepped to the side in that forest, I would never have seen him. I could have made it up to the hill and he could have grabbed me and I'd never been seen again. Or the fact that I live nearby. The creepiest part was that he grinned at me and made his way towards me. Now, any normal adult would have been like, "Hey, are you lost? Can I help you?" Nope, this guy just stood there and watched me for who knows how long. All I know is that it caught me completely by surprise. And he grinned. I can safely say that I've never, ever tried to cut through the forest again. I will occasionally go on the top of the road and onto the highway, but I never go deep into the road ever again. It's creepy how it leads seemingly nowhere. I've not encountered the creepy dude since, and hopefully I never will. Story 7. So I live on a remote New England street. I just moved here recently from New Mexico. We moved into a gorgeous house about 4 driveways up from a Mormon church. This church has services at random times. I'm agnostic and not truly tuned into the schedule that they keep. So tonight, I was driving home from work and listening to a new episode from True Crime Garage podcast. I didn't want to stop listening. So instead of driving straight home, I slowed my speed so I could finish my episode and decided to do a slow turn around the church as I listened. I'm super paranoid because of all my true crime obsessions. So my car doors were always locked. But since we live in a safe and upper-class neighborhood, I wasn't terribly on alert, even though the church was dark. But as I cruised around the church lot to enjoy my podcast, a man stepped out of the shadows of the church's dumpster and into the light. He was walking in a bizarre stumbling gait and actually lunged at my car door. He had a beard, but was otherwise kempt and clean looking. So it was the odd manner of his gait that scared me. I floored it and drove off as fast as possible as he lurched at my SUV. His fingernails actually scratching at the metal, my back door. I was so freaked out that I drove for a while, not going home, but just circling streets till I finally went home. My husband is out of town for training. He's military. So it's just me and my 2 pit bulls. They make me feel pretty safe. And I do have a gun that my husband leaves me. But as a true crime addict, I'm always on edge. I called my husband, Aaron, and he reassured me that it was probably a homeless guy, but to keep the gun nearby and the dogs by the bed. So I do my nightly routine and head to bed. As I'm falling asleep, my dogs go wild, barking, rushing from door to window. I lie stock still upstairs and keep my hand on my gun as I listened to them barking over the pounding of my heart. I hear the front doorknob rattle as someone tries to twist it open. I can hear my dogs barking and snarling. And after a few seconds, one of them hits the window downstairs, barking his head off. I slid off my bed and grabbed myself, dialing 911 from the floor. About 30 silent minutes later, cop cars pull into my yard and take my statement. I was still terrified and shaking. And when I went to the door to talk to them, the porch light illuminated footsteps all around my door in the snow and around each window. I can only imagine it was a guy from the church, but I have no idea how he knew which house was mine. I park in the garage. So he must have been watching as I came home and pulled in, recognizing my vehicle. My husband is home now, but I'm still scared stiff. I don't even walk in front of our uncurtained French doors. I'm terrified. Story 8. I've almost been kidnapped twice. This is the story about the second time. I just graduated from college and was still living outside the major city my school was near. There's a public transit that is relatively reliable. So sometimes I would go into the city for special occasions, knowing I could get back safely. For Halloween that year, my boyfriend and I decided to take the train and actually go to an event, not just a house party. This is only important because of how it influenced my outfit. As a female, there are lots of footwear rules. And I was worried if I didn't wear heels, I might not be allowed into the club we were going to. I debated for, well, way too long and switched between heels and flats a couple of times. I was wearing a black dress that I turned into a black widow spider costume by putting a red cutout on the front. And in the end, I ended up wearing black Chucks sneakers. The night was great and relatively uneventful. I didn't get hassled by my flats. At some point, I decided I was exhausted. I wanted to head home. But my boyfriend was going strong and really didn't want to leave. Which was no problem. Since we took public transportation, he gave me the key to his house, which was about a mile from the train station. We planned that I would head back and he would join me later. The mile I had to cover went by a mall, a school, and finally a church that abruptly ended and turned into a row of houses that boyfriend lived in. There was a designated sidewalk the whole way, but it also ran along a 4-lane road. I knew there was potential for late-night vagabonds, but I figured they'd be mostly around the station or the mall. So, by the time I was at the church and could see my destination, which was the second house on the row. I was considering myself safe. As I passed the church on the right sidewalk, I'm about 200 yards from the house and I hear a vehicle start to slow down as it approaches me on my left. The speed limit for the area was 35, but people often fly down it. And I'd say on average people go 45 miles an hour on this road given there were 2 lanes each way. The van had probably been going about 45 because the sound of it slowing down was noticeable. I say van because the sound of the deceleration caused me to turn and see a white, hard-sided, really dark-tinted, front-windowed van pulling over. Luckily, it was going so fast it wasn't able to stop until it had me passed by about 20 yards, where it just sat idling next to the sidewalk. I stopped walking because there was no reason for the van to stop there, and I didn't want to walk by the sliding door. After about 30 seconds, which felt like an hour, of the van idling and no one getting out, I decided to quickly scuttle up on the church flower beds so that I wouldn't be close enough to be grabbed by anyone who might open the sliding door. At first, nothing happened, and I felt dumb for being paranoid, and that's when I sent 1,000 prayers for deciding to wear flats that night. After about 10 seconds of letting me walk on, I heard the van gun its engine and watched as it zoomed by and then screeched to a stop in front of me, 10 feet away, cutting into the sidewalk with the tail sticking into the road. Hearing the driver's door open sent a jolt of adrenaline that I've never felt before or since. I took off sprinting in my glorious flats. As I passed the front of the van, I saw the driver passing the side mirror, meaning he was already outside his door attempting to make his way to the front. This is basically the end of the story, because I, up on my toes, sprinted all the way to the house and cut through some trees to lose him. I wasn't pursued any further as far as I could tell and was able to get inside and lock the door. I will always be grateful I ended up wearing flats that night so I could run for my life. I don't really like considering what might have happened if I had been in heels. Story 9. Despite living out in the middle of nowhere on a 400-acre farm, we've still had problems with someone coming into our house, moving stuff around, and occasionally taking something like trash bags or food. It started in early 2016. We would be laying in bed and hear stuff being moved around in the middle of the night. But by the time we got up and about, no one was there. Damage was done to our old front door after someone tried to get in. Several times we would come home to the front door hanging open. This behavior isn't constant. It actually only happens once, twice every couple of months. Last month I heard a car door shut in the middle of the night, and when we checked the lights were on inside. Our motion detector lights outside are tripped at all hours of the night. Well, I saw this person for the first time last night. It was only a glimpse, and they were wearing dark clothes. By the time my husband got out there, they were gone again. I don't know where they go, but they always run. We hear them running sometimes down the left side of our house out towards the field. There are woods beyond that. Okay, today I had my music playing over in a speaker in the kitchen while I jumped in the shower. Not 4 to 6 minutes after I got in, I heard my music shut off suddenly. I had a really bad feeling, but I also felt like I should just stay in the locked bathroom, and I'm glad I did. My music had been paused. My phone moved completely. My front door was hanging open. There was mud on my floor. I've always had an issue with anxiety, and I'm kind of a paranoid person anyway, so it's super hard for me to attempt to stay calm. My husband will be home soon. He keeps texting to make sure everything is okay and I'm not stressing too bad because it's not good for the baby. So creepy guy who's been stalking my house and doesn't like music. Let's not meet again. Story 10. Well, first of all, I'm sorry if my English isn't the best, but I'm from Italy and I learned it on my own. This is my first time writing here. I'm going to tell you this strange episode from my childhood. I was 9 to 10 years old. I used to go to school on my own, just walking. It wasn't that far, like a 10-minute walk. Every day I went the same way. It was the shortest, but it was isolated. I was walking alone as always when I noticed a police car coming on my left. There was a middle-aged man, obviously a policeman, who slowed down and started talking to me. He said something like, "Hey kid, are you going to school?" And I said, "Yes." He kept driving near me and asked if I wanted to get in the car so he could take me to school faster. I said, "No. My mom always told me not to talk with strangers." He said, "I'm not a stranger. I'm a policeman. You can trust me." I thanked him and told him there was no problem because school wasn't that far. He insisted. So we sped up a little bit, went in front of me and opened the car door. "Come on, it will be fun to take a ride in the police car. It's almost every children's dream." That's when I said once again, "No, please leave me alone." Kept the car door open staring at me and then I started to walk faster until I went down a little street and I started to run to the point where I didn't even see the car behind me. I was shocked. I was very young, you know. That policeman had a weird smile. Very disturbing. Like almost unnatural. Since that day, I never took that way again. And my mom started to come with me for the first few mornings to school. I never realized what he wanted or if he had good or bad intentions. Just taking advantage for the fact he was a policeman so kids would trust him more easily. I'm happy though that I never discovered what was on his mind. Who knows? Story 11. This happened to my dad 10 years ago. Nothing too crazy, but I was relatively young at the time, so it creeped me out. We lived in a smallish city in a residential neighborhood about 20 minutes from the downtown. It was summer. My dad was up late riding. Around 3 a.m. He saw a male and female anywhere from 25 to 30 years old walking down the street. They walked right up our driveway into our front door, possibly because they saw a light on inside and knocked on the door. My dad was already suspicious of their plans and decided not to open the door. Our door had a large glass window on it, and if you spoke loudly enough you could hear someone on the other side. My dad asked them what they wanted and they asked to come inside. My dad of course refuses, but the couple asked if he could call them a cab. My dad says okay, and the couple again asks if they can come inside. My dad says no and tells them to go wait out at the end of the driveway. My dad then turns away from the door, shuts off all the lights in the house. He never called a cab but went to the window to watch the couple. They walked to the end of the driveway, appear to have a conversation, then walk down the road and out of sight. I can understand someone asking for a cab if you live near a bar or a restaurant, but like I said, we're 20 minutes away from any bar. Our neighborhood was mostly young families. It was very safe. We had a few incidents of people going through our cars at night if we left them unlocked, but that was it. I was asleep the whole time this was happening. When my dad recounted the tale in the morning, it definitely spooked me. Afterwards, if I woke up in the middle of the night, I would have a difficult time getting back to sleep. My neighbors ended up having a break in a few months after this incident, so we decided to get an alarm system for the house. It definitely helps me sleep at night. Story 12. This happened about 2 years ago. I'm a 21-year-old female, and I was a junior in college living in a small apartment off campus with one female roommate. We were both busy students and rarely home at the same time. One afternoon I was sitting at home by myself working on a project. A white truck that I didn't recognize pulls into the parking lot, which I can see from my window. I think nothing of it until I hear a knock at the door. A man maybe in his mid-50s, bearded with white overalls that were dirty, and he had a white cap on. I opened the door a bit without letting him in. Hello. Hi, I'm with the realty company that owned the property. We're doing a routine check of the smoke detector batteries and air filters. Now this was strange to me since this check had just been done a few months prior and we weren't due for another one yet. Additionally, the property manager always called ahead at least 24 hours per our lease agreement to let us know the contractors they hired to do this stuff were coming, and we hadn't been informed. I'm asked what contracting company he was with and if he had any identification on him, since his truck was unmarked and neither his hat nor his shirt had any kind of logo on them. I don't usually carry that stuff around with me. My name's Charlie. It'll only take a few minutes. We're doing all the units in the area. It was still suspicious to me. He should have at least something to identify himself. I had that gut feeling that you get when something just isn't right. I told him I didn't feel comfortable letting him in, and if he came back with ID, I would feel much better. He got visibly angry but agreed to come back later. He got in the truck and drove off, without getting into any of the other apartments, like he said he was going to. Heart pounding. I immediately shut and locked the door and called my roommate. She agreed it was weird and suggested I call our property manager. I don't recall sending anyone to that property today or recently. Here's the number for our contractor. Why don't you give him a call? When I called the contracting company and described the man, they said that not only did they not have anyone on that route today or anytime soon, but they also did not have a single employee by that name, or that looked anything like the man I described. They said I should probably call the police if it happens again. I was on edge for weeks, but he never returned. I don't want to think about what his intentions were. Story 13. Summer of 2004. My family was supposed to vacation in Kennebunkport, Maine. My father was stuck in meetings, so he was going to come up from Manhattan a few days after us. My mom wanted to drive up. Super annoying to me at the time, but we didn't have a choice. And my brother, sister, and I loaded into the car and started the drive. I was about 14 at the time. Drive was uneventful, but there were various delays, and we ended up getting in a lot later than originally planned. Because of this, the owners of the house we were renting had turned in for the night, and we weren't able to get a hold of them to get the keys. Sounds like horrible planning, but apparently, they were pretty strict about the time frame to pick up the keys. My mom decided she wanted lobster, so we went to one of our favorite spots. She called my dad to see if he would make us reservations at a hotel in Kennebunkport from New York City while we ate. We were enjoying the lobster while a guy came up and started chatting with my mom. I figure it was just a friendly local making conversation. During this, my dad calls my mom and my mom excuses herself to speak to him. Apparently, all hotels were booked for the night. Go figure. height of vacation season in Kennebunkport. The plan was for us to drive to the nearest town and just find somewhere to stay until we could pick up the keys for a vacation home. Apparently, the local had been listening into my mom's conversation and came back over once she got off the phone. I want to say there was nothing outwardly off about him. He was preppy, clean-cut, unassuming, and fit in with the clientele. He told my mom he had a big home with a big guest house we were more than welcome to stay at, and his wife wouldn't mind. No way in the world I was staying in a random dude's house in creepy Maine in the dark. No offense to anyone from Maine, but the streets get creepy. My mom, doing her due diligence, determined this guy was legit. Said he was in finance. My mom was an investment banker, and they chatted enough for my mom to determine he was totally full of it. I called my dad hysterical. He said I was overreacting and that I needed to get out of the city more and accept that sometimes people are just nice. So, my brother, sister, and I got into our car and followed him back to his house. The guest house was really nice, fully furnished, but the beds were oddly placed. The guest house had 2 bedrooms, and instead of the beds being located in the middle centered, imagine a symmetrical room layout, they were right under the window in each room. Just seemed out of place. Anyway, fast forward, we are all getting ready to go to bed. My mom hears a knock on the door, and it's the guy. He said he just wanted to check to make sure we got settled. Cool, nice thing to do. About 30 minutes later, he comes back to check in again. At this point, my mom was like, "Thanks, we're good. We will stop by the house in the morning to say thank you," etc. Fast forward another 30-45 minutes. I can't sleep. I'm terrified. We hear this rustling, which is odd because the guest house was nowhere around trees or close proximity to bushes that might cause such a noise. At this point, I see my mom wide awake and look up at the window, like motioning towards the window with her eyes. Let me add, none of the windows had curtains. The guy said it's because his wife was in the process of redecorating. When I looked up, there was a male figure just standing. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. I don't know how long he was there for. When he walked away, my mom waited a bit and then he told us to get our stuff together. She wasn't messing around. We had my dad on the phone at this point. He was pretty much flipping out at my mom about something, but I didn't hear what. My mom said she was going to put stuff in the car and to follow her out. This was around 2 a.m. When we got into the car, we pulled around to the front of the main house, so my mom could return the key and say thanks. However, when we got to the front, all of the lights were off. Not just all lights, but it looked like no one had been home. Porch light, table lamp in front windows, everything black. Also, the 2 cars were gone, the local's car and what we presumed to be his wife's car. After seeing this, my mom at this point pretty unsettled, said we were leaving and we proceeded to drive to the gate. The gate at the end of the driveway had been dead bolted, bad locked shut from the inside. It wasn't a super strong gate, so my dad said rev it. We were in a big SUV and just get out of there. We drove straight back to New York City, not speaking the entire time. We have never returned back to Maine, and my parents refused to speak about it. I asked a family member one night about it when he was drunk, and all he said is they didn't tell you. The actual owners of the house were on vacation. I'm assuming my mom or dad followed up with local authorities and figured that out, but never told us. I don't know who that man was or what was planned that evening. I was curious as to whether there were any known serial killers or murderers who were in the area at the time, whether traveling through. Story 14. My mom owns her own business and works extremely hard. This means she spends many late nights sitting on the living room floor with her work sprawled out around her. One night, back in 2003, she had her typical routine going, sorting through paperwork and making piles. It was late, close to midnight on a Wednesday, so when the phone rang, she was a bit surprised. My dad worked third shift at a factory, so she assumed it was him. When she answered the phone, there was no reply, just lots of heavy breathing. Admittedly creeped out, she hung up and called my dad. He told her he hasn't called, and she left it at that. Keep in mind, this was almost 15 years ago, and we lived in a small town with practically no crime. We never locked our doors and were never scared of dangerous people. But the phone calls kept coming. Every night, multiple times at night, and the person on the other end started talking. He started by saying, "Hello, Diane. You're so beautiful. I'd love to meet you." And things quickly escalated into him going into graphic detail of how he wanted to rape and strangle her. Of course, she stopped answering the phone, and she informed the police. But nothing was ever done, and the phone would continue to ring. My parents weren't in the situation where my dad could stay home from work, and my mom truly believed the calls were just empty threats, so things continued on. Until one night, he got brave. My mom was sitting on the floor in front of our huge mirrored cabinet with all her work around her when the phone rang. She ignored it as usual. She was concentrating hard on a piece of paper in front of her when a glimmer of light in the mirror caught her eye. She looked up to see a pair of eyeglasses peering at her in the reflection. She spun around to face the front door, which her back had been turned to, and a man was standing there staring at her. She said they both just stared at each other for what felt like forever, until she saw the doorknob turn. She started screaming, and the man quickly ran away. In light of the phone calls, my parents had started locking all the doors, which was a totally foreign concept to our household. My older brother, who was about 17 at the time and was aware of the phone calls, came running down the stairs with a baseball bat, but the man was long gone. When the police came, they scoured our property and came across close to 200 cigarette butts right underneath our living room windows, hidden behind bushes. He had been watching her for weeks. The police also happened to find a bike tire trail coming from the windows and going down the sidewalk. They took the cigarette butts and did DNA testing on them and were able to match them to a convicted rapist who lived down the street from us. Robert Ham was arrested while riding his bike. He went to prison for menacing and attempt to commit a crime. He had many priors, so we assumed he would be locked up for quite some time. The reason I'm telling this story is because he was released from prison earlier this year. Story 15. This is a short story about something that none of us could explain. I've been working in the same electronics store for about a year now. It's a big store with 2 floors. We sell just about everything. Household appliances, computers, TVs, cell phones, cables, vacuum cleaners. You name it, we sell it. Everything here has always been normal. Nothing odd has ever happened as long as I've been here. I have never heard any stories about anything out of the ordinary. I mean, it's a store. We do get robbed from time to time. But I suppose I'll count that as normal too. But this was until about a month ago. Usually, I work the closing shift. We close the store at 8 p.m. After closing, There's 3 of us that has to stay until 8:30 in case someone tries to get in after closing or something. 1 salesman, 1 storeman, and a cashier. That's me. This has never happened since I started working here. But it's policy. So we stay. Anyway, about a month ago, I was given thumbs up that all customers were out of the store and that I could begin my little closing procedure. I was done closing the counter at about 8:20. I had counted all the money and put everything back in the safe. I locked up and went downstairs to the staff room. Like I said, normally, we're only 3 at this point. But I found a group of my co-workers gathered around our surveillance monitors. I heard them muttering something like, "What, there's still a person in here." They usually do a thorough check before we start locking up everything. So I went to the group of people gathered and I took a look for myself. Yes, there she was. A woman who was still walking around on the ground floor of the store, looking at stuff in the dark. One of my co-workers went back out on the floor to talk to her and tell her that the store was closed and that she had to leave. We saw her react to the sound of the staff room door open. He came back a while later and told us that he couldn't find her. He had looked around everywhere and yelled out for her, but there was nothing. At this time, we could no longer see her on any of the monitors. So we decided to go out to look for her. All but 1. We were 11 people. We split up with 5 people searching each floor and 1 stayed inside the staff room to keep an eye on the monitors. We searched for what felt like forever. But we all came back empty-handed. She just wasn't there. We started discussing if there was any way she could have gotten out, but both her entrance and exit were locked. And anywhere else, you need a keycard with a personal code to get in. We checked the staff room too, just to be sure, but she was nowhere to be found. The guy who'd stayed in the staff room hadn't heard or seen anything since we left. It was just so weird. Were we going nuts? If there's no one there, then what the hell did we see on the monitors? We all saw her. All of us. Story 16. Hello, all. This is my first post. I had such a weird morning, though I just couldn't resist. This is a true story. Hopefully, we'll be updated if anything new occurs. I live in a historical dorm building in the Northwest, here in the US. Living on the 5th floor of this 100-year-old structure with no freaking elevator, I might add. The building is shaped like a U, and my windows face another dorm room across the way. I have been sleeping really bad recently, going to bed around 3 a.m. and waking up at 10 a.m. for class. I've never met my neighbor, never made eye contact with my neighbor. He was a male, with heavy curtains he always closes at dusk, and is open when I wake up. Today, I woke up really early, just walking by a weird dream I can't remember. I sat up in bed, and my bed somewhat faces the window where I can see the other window of my neighbor. It's not directly in front of it, and I have things sitting in my window so that I can't see all of their window and they can't see me in my bed. My windows are always fogged. I liked it that way, so no one can really look into my room clearly. There are 5 freaking windows in my studio room, and many opportunities to look into them. So I wake up, feeling groggy from not a ton of sleep. I saw movement in the window across the way, and my neighbor is opening their curtains, somewhat instinctively hid, so they couldn't see me watching them, but I could see him. He opened his curtains like something from a dramatic movie, both hands just splitting them down in the middle. And then, things got a bit weird. He opened the window curtains, and then he just stood there. It's like he froze. I watch him in the corner of my window. He wasn't making eye contact, but he just stared into my room, frozen. I sat there frozen as well, and we both stayed like that for 5 minutes. Suddenly, he breaks his daze and turned away and walked out of my view. I stayed in bed for a while, still tired as it was about 7 a.m., and I was like, what just happened? I got up, made coffee and sat back in bed. I watched some YouTube videos with my coffee and just chilled out and forgot about the weird starts of my day. I caught a glimpse of something in my window, and I look up and notice 3 streak marks that were definitely not there earlier this morning. With my windows being fogged all the time, probably from the heat inside my room and the humidity of outside, I realized that these 3 marks were new, and it was the same window pane I was watching my neighbor this morning. It's in the upper corner of the window. Nothing can touch it easily, such as the curtain or the objects in my lower window. I realized it was the same place my neighbor was staring at this morning. I didn't want to get up and check on it because I already knew what it was deep in my stomach. It looked like long fingers, just 3 fingers. I pushed the thought out of my mind and went back to finishing coffee. I couldn't help but look again after I got up to put my coffee cup in the kitchen. As I passed the window, I noticed a new development. There were now streak marks coming from the top of the finger marks on my window, and dragged across the entire window very lightly. I immediately called my mom, and she freaked out and thought there was an intruder at first, but I reassured her. No one had been in my room. She then asked if it was from the outside or inside of my window. I went up to it and slowly touched the marks. They were from the inside. I ruined the marks by doing this, which still bothers me. She told me to clean my windows and see if it happens again. I did so. It will see if it occurs again. Did the neighbors see something in my window? Something that was clearly not physically there in the room with me. But it seems like they saw something, or maybe they were in a trance of sorts. I'm not sure. Let's see what happens. Not sure I can sleep tonight. Story 17. One evening, when I was 16, I had taken my dog Tex to a park near my house. Tex is technically my dad's dog. My dad worked as a cop in our city, and Tex, a German Shepherd, works with him as a police dog. We had been there for about 2 hours, and it had started to get dark. So, I got Tex on his leash, and we headed for home. Our house was a few blocks away, and by the time we left the park, it had gotten dark. It was a Sunday night, so it was pretty quiet, until I started to hear a noise behind me. I looked over my shoulder, and across the street, heading in the opposite direction, was a man. He was dressed in an old Hawaiian shirt with old cargo pants and sneakers. He looked like he might have been about 50 or 60, and was totally bald. The strangest part of the whole scene was that he was dragging a rake behind him. This was the noise I heard. It was an old metal rake, and it was scraping on the pavement behind him. The other weird thing was how Tex reacted. He's always serious when he's on patrol with my dad, but is normally a marshmallow when he's at home. When he noticed this guy, though, his hackles went right up. His ears went down, and he started to growl. The guy stopped under a streetlight and turned to look at us. He just stared at us for a few minutes, so I tugged on Tex's leash, and we kept walking. After a few minutes, I turned and looked over my shoulder again. The guy was still staring at us, before he suddenly dropped his rake and started running right at us. Tex started barking as loud as he could, trying to get at the guy while I tried to pull him in the other direction. The guy had stopped when he saw Tex and just stood in the middle of the road. I was dragging Tex away while the guy continued to just stare. After a few minutes, he went back to get his rake, but this time, he started to follow us. He was walking normally, not hurrying or anything, but still following me, dragging his rake behind him. We finally made it to my house, and I told my dad what was happening. When I gave him the description of the guy, he calmly told me to wait in the room and went to make a phone call. My room looks out over the street, and I looked out of my window to see the guy standing in the middle of our driveway. I could hear Tex barking downstairs in the hall, and in the distance, I could hear sirens. As I looked down, I noticed that the guy had what looked like paint on his shirt front. I guess I had not noticed it while I was trying to get away. Suddenly, he looked up and noticed me at the window. He stood there, looking at me, and it occurred to me that he wasn't showing any emotion at all. The entire time he'd been walking, running at me and following me, he had always had an emotionless, almost bored face. He stood there, just staring at me. The police sirens got closer, and 3 cars finally pulled up to our house. 3 of the police grabbed the guy, and he went with them calmly into one of these cars. I came downstairs and explained to the police and my parents what had happened. It turns out that the guy was not from our neighborhood, but lived in the city. He had been diagnosed with severe mental issues and must have forgotten to take any of his medications. The police think he'd gotten on a bus with no real destination in mind, and when he got off, just grabbed a rake from someone's yard while he was walking. The paint I had seen was actually blood from someone he met about an hour before me, and he'd just beaten the person up with the rake before continuing on. My dad told me I was lucky I had texts with me, as it clearly deterred the guy from getting too close. I don't go out much after dark now, and when I do, I always make sure I'm either with other people or have texts nearby. Thank you for listening, and I wish you good health. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to support us. Thank you very much.